On a Monday morning in February of 2003, a man living in a quiet suburb in France was at home when his phone rang. He looked down at the screen, saw the number, and recognized it as belonging to a coworker. So he answered it. But when he put the phone to his ear, he didn't hear the familiar voice of his colleague. Instead, all he heard was a strange static, and in the background, the faint, muffled sound of voices. He thought it was probably just a pocket dial, but he kept listening anyway. He put the phone on speaker so his wife, who was in the room with him, could listen in as well. Together, they leaned in close, trying to make out what was being said. And as the seconds ticked by, they were able to decipher fragments of a conversation happening between two women they didn't know. The more they listened, the more unsettling the conversation became. It was clear these two women were talking about a murder. And then, one of the women distinctly said that they needed to come up with an alibi. On the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of February, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lunet was clearing the lunch dishes from the dining table at her home in Cunha, France. Her husband Claude and two of her adult sons, Frank and Pascal, were still sitting at the table finishing their coffees. As Monique moved back and forth from the kitchen, the men discussed what they still needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were all heading to a family gathering just outside of Paris, which was about a 3.5-hour drive away. The party was to celebrate the retirement of Claude's sister-in-law. Monique, however, was not going with them. She had told everyone that someone needed to stay behind to look after their 4 dogs, and while that was certainly true, it wasn't the whole story. The real reason Monique wasn't going was because she just did not get along with her husband's side of the family. The relationship was complicated and had been for a very long time. Monique and Claude had gotten married nearly 20 years earlier. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they each brought children from their previous relationships into the new family. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. For the first few years, this big, blended family had managed to get along reasonably well. But as time went on, serious cracks began to form. Personality clashes started to arise, specifically between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude had married, all 5 of his daughters were already teenagers or in their early 20s. So, while they accepted Monique as their father's new wife, they never really saw her as a mother figure. They were already very close with their biological mother, Claude's ex-wife, a woman named Beatrice. To them, Beatrice was their mother, and Monique was just an addition to the family, not a replacement. Then, in 1993, an event occurred that completely shattered the fragile peace. One of Claude's young grandsons, the son of one of his daughters, accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him. This accusation ripped the family in two. The incident was never reported to the police, so no official investigation ever took place to determine if the claim was true. But that didn't matter to the family. Claude's 5 daughters and his ex-wife Beatrice fully believed the grandson. They were convinced Jean-Luc was guilty. On the other side, Monique staunchly defended her son, insisting he would never do such a thing. Claude was trapped in the middle, torn between his wife and his daughters. The fallout was immense and ugly. The 2 sides of the family stopped speaking to each other entirely for a whole year. By 2003, as they prepared for this retirement party, they were all technically on speaking terms again, but the atmosphere was always incredibly tense and uncomfortable whenever they were all in the same room. And so, that was the other, more significant reason why Monique was not going to the party. And for the same reason, her son Jean-Luc wasn't going either. Finally, around 3 o'clock that afternoon, the bags were packed. Claude and the 2 sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car. Monique walked them to the front door. She said her goodbyes, gave her husband a kiss, and then stood on the doorstep watching as they all climbed into the car and drove off down the street. A few hours passed. At around 6:30 in the evening, Monique heard a knock on her front door. She went to answer it, and when she opened it, she saw her son, Jean-Luc, standing on the porch holding his bicycle by the handlebars. He told his mom he was just stopping by for a quick visit on his way home from work. She smiled and told him to come on in. Jean-Luc leaned his bike against the exterior wall of the house and followed his mother inside. As he was taking off his coat in the entryway, he mentioned that her neighbor from across the street, a man named Henri, had been staring at him as he rode up. It wasn't just a casual glance. Jean-Luc said it felt like the man was spying on him. This comment unsettled Monique a bit. Henri was known in the neighborhood for being something of a loose cannon. He had a particular obsession with people parking in front of his house. Anytime someone dared to park their car on the public street in front of his property, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle. He'd been known to slash tires or pour motor oil all over the hoods of cars. The man simply did not care about consequences. Over the years, Monique and her sons had gotten into several heated arguments with Henri over parking spaces. One of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But tonight, Jean-Luc hadn't come by car, he was on his bike. So, Monique just hoped that whatever issue Henri had, it wouldn't escalate into anything. There was no car to vandalize, so hopefully, he would just leave them alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen and poured them both a glass of sparkling wine. They sat at the kitchen table and chatted for about 30 minutes, just catching up. After they finished their drinks, Monique gave Jean-Luc a quick haircut in the kitchen. Then, at around 5 minutes past 7, Jean-Luc said it was time for him to go. He needed to get back to his apartment for dinner with his wife. He said goodbye to his mom, walked outside, and was relieved to see that his bicycle was untouched. The tires hadn't been slashed. He got on his bike and rode off into the evening. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique went about her evening routine. She corralled her 4 dogs, putting them behind a baby gate that sectioned off the base of the staircase. She gave them their food and fresh water. Then she went back into the kitchen and started to prepare a simple dinner for herself. But a little while later, at around 7:30, Monique heard another knock at the front door. She knew it was very unlikely to be Jean-Luc again. As she walked down the long hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri from across the street. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling groggy and tired. She hadn't slept well at all. Throughout the night, she'd been kept awake by the sound of dogs barking incessantly somewhere in the neighborhood. She got out of bed, walked over to her bedroom window, and pulled open the blinds. As her eyes adjusted to the bright morning light, she glanced down from her second-story window into the yard of the white 2-story house next door. That was Monique's house. As she looked, she noticed something dark lying in the middle of the paved walkway that led from the sidewalk to Monique's front door. The neighbor pressed her face against the cool glass of the window and squinted, trying to get a better look. And then her heart stopped. She realized what she was seeing was not a pile of clothes or a bag of trash. It was a body lying face down on the pavement. In a rush of panic, the woman stumbled back from the window, ran out of her room, grabbed the phone from the hallway, and dialed the police. A couple of hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Ann P. pulled her car up to the curb in front of a white 2-story house now cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape. A medical examiner's van was already parked out front. As Captain P got out of her car, a uniformed officer walked over to greet her. He led her through the gate and over to where the body of a woman was lying in the front yard. The officer told the captain that the victim was Monique Loon, and she had been discovered just like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. He said that based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died sometime between 8 o'clock and midnight the night before. Captain P crouched down to get a better look at the body. But even from a distance, she could tell that the woman had suffered gruesome, horrific injuries. There was blood covering Monique's face and caked onto her clothes. Her torso appeared to have been completely shredded by what were clearly multiple stab wounds. Just by looking at the scene, Captain P guessed that this woman had been stabbed at least a dozen times, probably more. She also noticed obvious defensive wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms. The cuts and slashes on her skin told a clear story. Monique had put up a fierce fight against her killer. After a few more moments observing the body, Captain P stood back up. She asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. The officer said, no, not really, aside from the fact that Monique's 4 dogs had been barking non-stop for most of the night, starting at around 8 o'clock. Captain P nodded, taking this in. She thanked the officer and then made her way over to the front door of the house. The door was closed. She examined the frame and the handle, looking for any signs of a forced entry, but she didn't see any. What she did see was a smeared, bloody handprint on the exterior wall just to the side of the door. She carefully turned the handle, which was unlocked, and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her was chilling. The hallway just inside the entrance was absolutely covered in blood. Spatter marked the walls, and a large pool had collected on the floor. Captain P carefully stepped inside, making sure to avoid disturbing any of the blood or leaving any of her own footprint. She moved slowly down the hallway, peering into the other rooms. She saw that, for the most part, the blood spatter was contained to the entryway. This told her that the attack on Monique had likely started and ended right here, in this small space. Her initial working theory began to form. Monique must have had a visitor. Someone knocked, she opened the door, and she was attacked almost immediately. But then, as Captain P stepped back outside and onto the front porch, she looked down at the walkway again and noticed something that didn't make any sense. Despite the massive amount of blood just inside the front door, there was not a single drop of blood on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. Given the volume of blood Monique had clearly lost inside the house, Captain P seriously doubted that she would have been physically capable of running out into the yard after such a brutal attack. So she started to wonder if perhaps the body had been moved after she had died. Monique was a large woman. If her killer had been able to overpower her in a fight and then also carry or drag her body that distance after she was dead, Captain P assumed that the killer had to be quite strong. In her mind, she began to build a profile of the suspect. It was likely a big, strong man. But what she couldn't figure out was why. Why would a killer go to the trouble of dragging a corpse out into the front yard where any passing neighbor could easily see it? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique's body to be found as soon as possible. And since it seemed that Monique had willingly opened the front door to her attacker, Captain P was fairly certain that the killer was someone Monique knew. Around noon that same day, Saturday, February 8th, Captain P was about to go next door to speak with one of Monique's neighbors herself when a car suddenly pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out. They looked at the police tape and the official vehicles with expressions of complete shock and deep concern. By this point, Captain P had learned from other neighbors that Monique had a husband and several adult sons. She assumed that these 3 men must be them. She immediately hurried down the walkway to intercept them to keep them from walking into the active crime scene. The 3 men crowded around her, their voices overlapping as they asked what was going on, where was Monique, what had happened. Captain P gently told them the devastating news that Monique had been stabbed to death. At first, all 3 of them fell completely silent, stunned. Then, one of the men, one of the sons, just broke down and started to cry. Captain P explained that they couldn't go into the house yet, so instead, she led them over to the curb and they all sat down. She could see that the men were in deep shock. It seemed like their minds couldn't even process the words she had just told them. But it was critical for the investigation to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So, Captain P took out a small notepad and a pen and gently began asking them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, explained that all 3 of them had left the house around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home by herself. He told her about the family gathering near Paris they had gone to, how they had stayed overnight, and had only just gotten back into town. They saw the police presence from down the street and had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Captain P asked Claude to give her the names of everyone in their family. all the adult children from both sides, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everyone. As Claude listed the names, he insisted that he just couldn't imagine anyone in their family being involved in something like this. Captain P nodded patiently. She knew from experience that, unfortunately, family members were often involved in these kinds of cases. But she kept her thoughts to herself. Instead, she just asked, "Can you think of anyone at all who would want to hurt Monique?" Claude thought for a long moment and then shook his head. He said no, she lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then, one of the sons spoke up. He said that, actually, there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed to the house directly across the street. A minute later, Captain P was knocking on the front door of Henri's house. After a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered. He seemed very curious about all the commotion across the street. Captain P eventually told him directly that his neighbor, Monique, had been murdered, and when she said that, Henri smiled. A small but unmistakable smile. Immediately, alarm bells started ringing in Captain P's head. This man's reaction was deeply suspicious. She asked him if she could come inside and look around his house. Henri didn't seem surprised by the request at all, almost as if he was expecting to be treated as a suspect. He just said, "Sure, come on in," and stepped aside. Captain P entered the house and began a systematic search of every room, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or anything else that seemed suspicious or out of place. Eventually, she made her way back to the living room where Henri was waiting for her. She asked him where he was the previous evening. He told her very casually that he and his wife were right here, at home. To Captain P, this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with his wife later to confirm his story. Next, she asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. Henri said no, but then he paused. He said there was one thing. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. At this, Captain P's attention sharpened. The family had already told her that Monique had a third adult son, Jean-Luc, who had not gone to the party in Paris. If Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to have seen Monique alive. And that meant he could even be her killer. The next morning, Captain P led a forensics team up the stairs of a run-down apartment building in a sketchier part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment. A moment later, a young man answered. After confirming his identity, 2 officers escorted a very confused Jean-Luc away to be questioned back at the police station. Meanwhile, Captain P and the forensics team went inside to search his apartment. It didn't take long to find something. As Captain P was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something he'd found. She walked over to him and saw he had his flashlight out, and he was pointing the beam at a spot on the wall near the staircase. When she got close enough to see, she could make out what appeared to be tiny, dried droplets of blood. Captain P pulled out her own flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor, looking for any more potential evidence. She found a few more reddish droplets near the doorknob of a closet. She opened the closet door, and inside, leaning against the back wall, was a bicycle. She shined her flashlight over the bike, looking at the wheels and the frame. And then she saw it. There were reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of the bike, as if whoever had ridden it last had driven right through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Captain P walked into an interrogation room at the police station. Jean-Luc was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and his face was a mask of fear and confusion. Captain P sat down across from him and got straight to the point. She asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc explained that he had just stopped by for a visit after work, something he did often. He said he only stayed for about half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Captain P asked him if he had gone straight to his own apartment afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, a man named Christophe, lived in the same apartment building on the floor directly below them. So, before going upstairs to his own unit, he had stopped by to chat with Christoph for a few minutes. After that, he said he spent the rest of the night in his apartment with his wife. To Captain P, it felt like there had to be more to the story. They had found what looked like blood in his apartment and what looked like a lot more blood on his bike. She figured that if she pushed him hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So, she told him point blank that they had found blood in his living room and that it was being sent to the lab for analysis. When Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red. He began to stammer, explaining that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting their apartment a few days earlier. Captain P nodded, but then she told him they had also found what looked like blood all over his bicycle. Jean-Luc hesitated. He stuttered and stammered, but couldn't seem to come up with any explanation for that. At this point, Captain P felt like she had him cornered. She told him to be quiet for a moment and to roll up his sleeves so she could see his arms. Captain P knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she had fought back hard. She must have left at least a few scratches or bruises on her attacker. However, when Jean-Luc finally rolled up his sleeves, Captain P saw that his hands and forearms were completely clear. There wasn't a single scratch or bruise on him. A few minutes later, Captain P left the interrogation room and walked back to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was still acting incredibly suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go just yet. But she also knew she couldn't afford to get tunnel vision. She didn't want to completely ignore other potential suspects, just in case the blood in Jean-Luc's apartment turned out to be a strange coincidence. So, she sat down at her desk, opened a file, and began flipping through the notes from interviews her team had already conducted with the rest of Monique's family and neighbors. Monique's other sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had already spoken to all of the stepdaughters as well as their husbands. And even though some of them admitted they still had issues with Monique, every single one of them had a solid alibi for the night Monique was killed. Several other family members had also mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had already tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had told them that for the most part, she and Monique stayed out of each other's way. They hadn't even seen each other in over a month. And besides that, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4'9" tall, she was 58 years old, and just seemed very weak. It seemed almost impossible that she could have physically overpowered the much larger Monique, inflicted such horrific injury, and then dragged her body out to the front yard. It just didn't seem plausible. So, while she wasn't completely ruled out, she was very low on the list of suspects. Just then, there was a knock on Captain P's office door. She looked up and saw another officer standing there. He told her there were 2 people in the station who wanted to speak with her. Captain P nodded. A moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman were shown into her office. They sat down across the desk from her, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Loon investigation. Captain P sat up straight, grabbed her notepad, and said, "Okay, tell me what you have." She began writing, as the man explained, that he was a co-worker of Christophe, Jean-Luc's brother-in-law. Captain P immediately recognized the name. That was the person Jean-Luc claimed to have visited on the night of the murder, right after leaving his mother's house. The man sitting across from her said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's phone number, but when he answered it, all he could hear was that muffled conversation between 2 women. At first, the man thought it was just an accidental call, maybe made by one of Christophe's kids playing with the phone. However, the man said when he put the phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman with him now, both started listening very closely, and they were able to make out snippets of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi, and they said something about a man named Jean-Luc. The couple had heard one woman say something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Captain P could not believe what she was hearing. Any lingering doubts she might have had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much vanished in that moment. She took down the couple's names and contact information, showed them out of her office, and as soon as they were gone, she grabbed her keys and headed straight for Christophe's apartment. By this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned. He had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the strange phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Captain P hoped that a search of his apartment might tell a different story. She walked through each room of the small apartment until she found the laundry area. She put on a pair of latex gloves, opened the washing machine, and reached inside. She pulled out a pair of men's pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. She held the pants up to the light, and she could clearly see a brownish stain on one of the legs. She also noticed that the pants looked like they would be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and heavy-set guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a smaller man, a man like Jean-Luc. Later that same day, which was now February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain P was back in her office when her phone rang. She answered it. It was a technician from the crime lab calling to tell her that they already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. Captain P braced herself, ready to hear the case-breaking news she was expecting. But what the tech told her was not what she expected at all. He said that the stains on the bicycle were indeed blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood found in Jean-Luc's apartment, the ones on the walls and near the closet door, were human blood, but they were not a match for Monique. And then he told her that the stain on the pants they had found in the washing machine wasn't blood at all. It was just grease. Captain P was incredibly frustrated. In her mind, she had completely zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now, they had absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the crime. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those two women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had overheard the conversation correctly. Maybe they had misheard the part about the alibi, or the part about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knew if they had actually heard that? Captain P thanked the lab technician for the update, as disappointing as it was. She was about to hang up when he told her to wait, that he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had found something significant. They had found DNA under Monique's fingernails. It was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it properly. But once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects and hopefully find a match. This gave Captain P a new sense of hope. After she hung up the phone, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from. She knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and from Christophe. And that neighbor, Henri, still seemed like a strong suspect too. Captain P had spoken to Henri's wife, who confirmed that they were together the whole night Monique was killed. But she also knew that spouses often lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi at best. At this point, Captain P felt like she had 3 decent potential suspects to get DNA from, but that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point. None of the other neighbors seemed like viable suspects, and by all accounts, Monique lived a quiet suburban life and didn't really have any enemies. So, there was no one else. To Captain P, it felt like there was a huge piece of the puzzle missing. She thought to herself that in the time she had while waiting for the DNA analysis, she needed to go back over everything and see if there was something she had overlooked. And so, over the next few weeks, that's exactly what Captain P did. She pored over all the evidence they had collected. She re-interviewed all the family members. She spoke to all the neighbors again. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that pointed to any other suspects. And then, in early March, about 3 or 4 weeks after that first call, Captain P got another call from the crime lab. The technician on the line told her that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they had tested it against any of their specific suspects, the initial results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Captain P heard what the technician had to say, she realized that this was it. This was the missing piece of information she had been looking for all along. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and an eventual confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Linné on the night of the 7th of February, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting her visitor inside, Monique just stood there with her arms crossed, staring. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then, at some point during the argument, Monique slammed the door right in the killer's face. But just before she did, she said one last thing. Something that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. Without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this final cutting remark, stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby. They reached under the driver's seat and grabbed a knife they kept there for self-defense. They carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. As soon as the door opened a second time, the killer pushed their way inside. And with a surge of uncontrollable rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was a strong, large woman, and she fought back with everything she had. She managed to knock the killer to the ground and actually pin them there. But the killer wrestled their arm free, the one that was holding the knife, and continued the attack. Monique kept fighting back. It was an epic, desperate struggle. And the whole time this was happening, Monique's 4 dogs, who were behind the baby gate just a few feet away, were watching everything. They were barking like mad. Monique was screaming out in rage and pain and panic. Finally, the killer was able to break away from Monique, who had them pinned despite being stabbed repeatedly. Once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got into their vehicle, and started to pull away from the curb. And as they did, they looked back and saw Monique stumble out of her front door. She took a few steps down the walkway, and then she collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. They drove to a nearby supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, into a large trash can. Then, the killer went home and they burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this horrific crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were the last person anyone would ever suspect of such a violent murder. It would turn out that the killer was the 4'9" tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed that she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally try and bury the hatchet after years and years of feuding between the two sides of the family. But she said the bad blood ran too deep. And when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the final inflammatory line as she shut the door. Beatrice said that in that moment, she just snapped. Beatrice had initially been ruled out as a suspect, primarily because she was just so small. She seemed too small to have overpowered Monique, and definitely too small to have moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out that Monique's body was not moved at all. She had stumbled out into the yard herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after the attack that she had managed to chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And she did this after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside the house. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to scratch her attacker, getting traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. The initial DNA analysis immediately showed that the killer was a woman. and further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out for sure who made that bizarre phone call to Christoph's coworker, but their best guess was that the women who were overheard on the phone were Christoph's mother and sister, and it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker had simply misinterpreted. Beatrice Mattis was arrested on the 29th of March 2003. She confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted that confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the late 1990s, two teenage girls in rural New York had a strange weekend ritual. Almost every Friday night, they would sneak into the local cemetery and stay there for hours. At the time, it felt harmless, almost funny. Years later, one of those girls would become convinced that a single small decision they made out there had probably saved their lives. The girls were named Rachel and Molly. They weren't just casual friends, they were inseparable. The kind of friends who could carry on entire conversations with a glance across a crowded room. They belonged to a larger group at school, but even within that tight-knit circle, the two of them seemed to exist in their own little world. What brought them together in the first place was their shared obsession with goth culture. In the late 90s and early 2000s, being goth in a small American town made you stand out immediately. It meant black clothes, dark makeup, chipped black nail polish, heavy boots, and an embrace of everything strange and macabre. For some people, it was just fashion. For others, it felt deeper than that, almost like a way of seeing the world. Rachel and Molly fell completely into it. Rachel and Molly were committed. They loved the music, the clothes, the whole vibe. And one of their favorite things to do, something that became a sort of ritual for them and their friends, was to hang out in the local cemetery. At first, it was almost a joke, something they did ironically. They were the goth kids, so of course they would hang out in a cemetery. It felt a little on the nose, a bit theatrical. So the whole group went out there one night, mostly to laugh about it. But then they discovered that it was actually a pretty cool place to be. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and nobody bothered them there. It quickly became their go-to spot, especially on weekends. Typically, when Rachel, Molly, and their friends went to the cemetery, they would go at night. This was partly to maximize the atmosphere, to lean into the whole dark Gothic aesthetic of it all. But there was another, more practical reason. They always went as a group. It was never just Rachel and Molly. It would be the two of them, plus several other people, a whole crew gathered among the tombstones. It was just more fun that way, with more people to talk to, more energy. But there was also a sense of safety in numbers. Despite how comfortable they had become there, it was still a cemetery after nightfall. It was still a place that held a natural creepiness, and having your friends around made it feel less intimidating, more like their own private park. One particular Friday night, Rachel was at home, bored and restless, when the phone rang. It was Molly. Her voice was upbeat, full of the usual weekend excitement. She asked Rachel the question she already knew the answer to. Hey, you want to go hang out in the cemetery? Rachel didn't even have to think about it. Duh, she said, laughing. That's what we do. I'd love to go. Are you guys coming to get me? And so Rachel got ready. She pulled on her favorite black jeans, a band t-shirt, and her heavy boots. She waited outside her house, the cool night air starting to settle in, watching for the familiar headlights of Molly's car. A few minutes later, the car pulled up, but as it got closer, Rachel noticed something was off. The passenger seats were empty. Molly was alone. This was unusual. Normally, the car would be full, music blasting, the sound of their friends' laughter spilling out into the night. Rachel walked over and climbed into the passenger seat, a question already forming on her lips. Hey, she said, buckling her seatbelt. So where is everyone? Are we going to pick them up now? Molly shook her head, turning the music down a little. Actually, no, she said. I tried calling everyone. But people are either busy or working, or I guess still recovering from last night. So it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Is that okay? Rachel paused. A small knot of unease tightened in her stomach. It wasn't that she didn't want to be alone with Molly. They were best friends, perfectly comfortable with each other. It was the location. They had an unspoken rule: never go to the cemetery alone. It was just different, without the noise and the safety of the group. But she looked over at Molly, who seemed to have already accepted it, and she didn't want to be the one to back out. She didn't want to seem scared or ruin Molly's plan. So she forced a smile. Oh yeah, that's fine, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. It is great. Just the two of us. Let's go. So, despite the flicker of hesitation, she settled into her seat, and they drove off, heading the short half-mile to the cemetery. This wasn't just any cemetery. It was enormous, an ancient place that stretched out over a vast expanse of land. To get in, you had to pass under a huge medieval-looking gate, a stone archway that loomed over the entrance. The massive wrought iron gates themselves were permanently open, but the archway gave the whole place a very Gothic, imposing feel. Once you passed through it, a single paved road cut straight through the center of the cemetery, running all the way to the back, probably over a mile long. This road effectively split the grounds into two huge sections, a left side and a right side. Rachel, Molly, and their friends had a favorite spot. As you drove in, it was in the far back left corner. They liked this area for a specific reason. The left side of the cemetery was full of rolling hills, and in that back corner there was a natural depression in the land. There weren't many tombstones in this little hollow, just a big boulder and a gnarled old tree next to it. It was a perfect hiding spot. If you were standing at the main gate and scanning the landscape, you wouldn't be able to see anyone who was down in that depression. They were completely tucked away, hidden by the contours of the earth. For a group of teenagers looking for a private place to hang out, it was ideal. So, Molly drove them through the imposing gate, and they made the familiar trip down the long straight road. It was getting dark now. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The world was quieting down for the night. As usual, the cemetery was deserted. No one else was ever really there, especially at this hour. The only exception was on the other side of the cemetery, the far right-hand side, on the complete opposite end from their spot. Sometimes, college kids from the local university would hop the fence over there and build a bonfire right up against the cemetery wall. It was completely against the rules, of course, but it happened from time to time. But that was rare, and tonight a quick glance in that direction showed nothing but darkness. The place was theirs. They reached the end of the road, parked the car, and got out. The air was cool and still. They walked from the road down the gentle, grassy slope into their familiar depression, their hangout spot. Once they were settled, they took up their usual positions, sitting on the big rock, leaning against the rough bark of the old tree. They lit up cigarettes and just started talking, falling into the easy rhythm of close friends. That's what goth teenagers in rural New York did in the 90s. They talked about everything and nothing, about boyfriends, about some drama that had happened at school, about teachers they liked and teachers they hated. As the sky turned from purple to a deep, inky black, Rachel started to relax. She thought to herself that this was actually kind of nice. It wasn't scary at all. It was peaceful, just having some one-on-one time with her best friend. But after they had been there for a while, a new scent drifted on the air. Smoke. Not cigarette smoke, but the distinct smell of a wood fire. They both noticed it at the same time. Their first thought was of the college kids. Even though they hadn't seen a fire when they arrived, they had been down in their hollow for a good while now. It was entirely possible that in that time, some students had hopped the fence on the far side of the cemetery and started one of their illegal bonfires. The fire itself didn't bother them. It was way over on the other side of the massive property. but they knew from experience what a bonfire meant. It meant that eventually the police would show up. You weren't allowed to have fires in the cemetery, and someone always called it in. The cops would come, make the college kids put the fire out, and then, as a matter of routine, they would do a full sweep of the entire cemetery to kick out anyone else who wasn't supposed to be there. That included them. Rachel and Molly looked at each other. They didn't even have to say anything. They were both thinking the same thing. They should probably just leave now before the police arrived and made them leave. Besides, they had been there for a couple of hours already. They were just about ready to go anyway. So, it was no big deal. They put out their last cigarettes, gathered their things, and turned to walk back up the hill, back towards the road where the car was parked. As they walked, they expected to reach the top of the hill and see the familiar sight of their car. The vast expanse of the cemetery spread out before them, and maybe, just maybe, the tiny flicker of a distant fire on the far right side. But when they crested the hill, that's not what they saw. Their car was there, just as they'd left it. But the fire wasn't on the other side of the cemetery. It was close. Shockingly close. To their right, maybe 100 meters away, was another depression in the landscape, another rolling hill that dipped out of sight. And just over the edge of that hill, they could see the tops of flickering flames. This was wrong. This was completely strange. When they had arrived, they were definitely the only ones on this side of the cemetery. There was no one else here. So, sometime while they were in their spot, someone else had shown up and started a fire right near them. They had never seen anything like this before. The college kids stuck to their own side. No one ever came over here. Who was it? The two girls stood there, frozen for a moment, a mix of curiosity and confusion. Did the college kids decide to move their party spot? They couldn't see the person or people around the fire, only the orange glow and the dancing flames licking at the night sky. They were pretty sure that whoever was over there had no idea that they were right here watching. A mischievous idea sparked between them. "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill?" Molly whispered. "We could peek over the top and see who it is. We could spy on them." Rachel hesitated for a second, but the curiosity was too strong. "Yeah, why not?" she agreed. "We're already here." So they turned around and walked back down into the base of their own depression, past the big rock and the tree where they had spent the last couple of hours. They crossed the bottom of the hollow and began to quietly walk up the opposite slope, the one that would give them a vantage point over the mysterious fire. They moved slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. As they got closer and closer to the top of the ridge, the crackle of the fire grew louder. Just as they were almost at the very top, where they would be able to peer over and see everything, Rachel's foot came down on a dry branch. It snapped with a loud crack that seemed to echo in the silent night. The only other sound was the fire. They hadn't heard any voices, no music, nothing. Rachel instantly clapped a hand over her mouth and shot a wide-eyed look at Molly. Molly looked back at her, annoyed. "What are you doing?" she mouthed. "We're trying to be quiet." They both froze, listening, waiting to see if they had been heard, but there was only silence. An eerie, heavy silence. And in that moment, the mood shifted completely. The sense of adventure and fun evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling feeling of dread. They still hadn't seen who was at the fire, but something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. They looked at each other, and the same thought was in both their eyes. "Maybe we should just go," Rachel whispered. Molly nodded immediately. "Yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right." So, as quietly as they could, they turned around and retreated, walking back down into the safety of their depression. They passed their rock and their tree and started walking back up the original hill, the one that led to their car and their escape. As they were about halfway up, a strange impulse made Rachel turn and look back one last time towards the ridge they had just abandoned. And her heart stopped. There was a man standing there now on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the bright orange glow of the fire. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly in their direction. He wasn't saying anything. He was just watching them. It was instantly clear this was not a college kid. He was older, broad-shouldered, and there was something deeply ominous about the way he stood there. "Molly, look!" Rachel gasped, grabbing her friend's arm. Molly turned, and her eyes went wide with fear. "Let's go," she hissed. "Let's get out of here right now." They stopped walking and started moving quickly, almost jogging up the grassy slope. A second later, Rachel risked another glance over her shoulder. The man was gone from the hilltop. For a split second, she felt a wave of relief. But then she saw movement in the darkness below the ridge. He was running. He was running down the hill, straight towards them. That's when they started screaming. Pure, terrified screams that tore through the quiet cemetery. They scrambled up the rest of the hill, their feet slipping on the dewy grass. Rachel kept looking back, and the man was gaining on them, his dark shape closing the distance with alarming speed. They reached the top of the hill and sprinted for Molly's car. Molly fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. They yanked the doors open, threw themselves inside, and slammed the locks down. Molly jammed the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. She slammed the car into drive and stomped on the gas, tires spinning on the gravel before they shot forward. As they sped away down the long, straight road, Rachel looked out the back window. The man had reached the road. He had almost caught them. He stood there for a moment, watching their taillights disappear into the darkness, and then he slowly turned and walked back down the hill, vanishing from sight. The drive home was a blur of panicked chatter. They were both totally shaken up. Who was that guy? What was he doing out there? What did he want? It was all so creepy, so surreal. They tried to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. By the time Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, they had started to downplay it, to turn it into a crazy story, almost as a defense mechanism to calm their own frantic nerves. "Man, that was insane, huh?" Molly said, trying for a light tone. They laughed, a little hysterically, and promised to stick to well-lit places for a while. It was just a weird night, a spooky encounter. Rachel went inside, not even mentioning the incident to her mom. She just went to her room, her heart still pounding, and tried to forget about it. Molly went home and did the same. The next morning, Rachel woke up and went downstairs to the kitchen. Her mom was already up, making coffee, going through her morning routine. The house was filled with the smell of brewing coffee and the sounds of a normal Saturday morning. When her mom saw her, she smiled. "Hey, how was your night last night?" she asked. Rachel shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Molly just went out for a bit. No big deal." Her mom paused, her expression turning serious. "Oh," she said. "Did you hear what happened last night?" Rachel felt a small chill. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" Her mom took a sip of her coffee. "Well, a woman from my office, in our town, she was kidnapped. Rachel's stomach dropped. She was taken from the parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me." "Oh my God," Rachel said. "What happened to her? Did they find her?" Rachel's mom looked at her, her eyes full of sadness. "No," she said softly. "I mean, yes, they found her. But it was too late. She was dead. And Rachel, whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. They burned her body in a huge bonfire." Her mom continued, "The police are still looking for whoever did it. They haven't caught him yet." In that instant, Rachel's entire world collapsed. The blood drained from her face as the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. That fire. That wasn't a bonfire. That man, he wasn't just some random creep. He was the killer. And the fire he was tending to, the fire they had almost stumbled upon, was burning the body of that poor woman. They had been right there, no more than 100 meters away, while this horrible, monstrous act was taking place. The thought was paralyzing. What would have happened if that man had caught them? What was he planning to do as he ran after them in the dark? Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she poured her heart out, telling her mom every single detail of the night before. Her mom listened, her own face pale with horror. "Oh my God, Rachel," she whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. "I can't believe this. You have to tell the police. They haven't caught this guy yet. You saw him. You have a description. You have to talk to them." So Rachel called Molly and told her what she had learned. Molly became hysterical, sobbing on the phone, the full weight of how close they had come crashing down on her as well. They agreed they had to go to the police. They went to the station together and told the detectives everything they could remember. But unfortunately, it wasn't much. It had been dark, they were scared, and it all happened so fast. They could only say he seemed to be an average-sized man, maybe in his 40s. It was a vague description at best, and they left the station feeling helpless, terrified that the man was still out there. For 2 days, they lived in a state of constant fear. But then, they got the news. The police had caught him. It wasn't because of their description. It was pure chance. An officer on patrol had spotted the victim's car being driven around town. They pulled the driver over, and it was him, the killer. After being arrested, he gave a full confession to the entire horrific crime. Rachel and Molly never forgot that night. When they looked back, they felt an overwhelming sense of luck, a chilling realization that their lives had hinged on one small, accidental sound. They were so fortunate that Rachel had stepped on that twig that the sharp crack had broken the spell of their foolish curiosity and made them turn back. If that hadn't happened, if they had continued on and peered over that hill, confronting the killer at the scene of his crime, it's terrifyingly possible that 2 teenage girls would have ended up in that bonfire as well. Before I started telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet, I had a very different life. I was in the military, a Navy SEAL for 7 years. For a long time, I thought that was going to be my whole life, my entire career. But things change. I ended up getting hurt, and if I'm being honest, it wasn't the perfect fit for me in the long run. So I eventually left the service, and the rest, as they say, is history. I have a lot of stories from my time in the military. Some of them are funny, about the crazy things we did in training. Some are scary, about things that happened overseas. But one story that has always stuck with me that really stands out is about what it was like to deploy to a war zone for the very first time. This isn't really a combat story, which is part of why it's so memorable for me. After years of training, almost 3 full years of grueling physical and mental challenges to become a SEAL, I finally made it. I was assigned to a SEAL team on the East Coast in Virginia, and we started training for our first deployment. We found out we were going to Afghanistan. This was back in 2013, and at that time, a deployment to Afghanistan almost certainly meant you were going to see combat. Active operations were still happening all the time. And for any direct action unit like the SEALs, that's what you want. Not because you're some bloodthirsty warmonger, but because that is the entire purpose of your training. You spend years preparing for this one thing, and you want to see if you can do it. So, I was getting my mind right, getting ready for combat. The day finally came. The way deployments work, at least for us, is they don't send the whole team on one plane. It's too risky. If that plane goes down, you lose an entire platoon. So, they break you up into small groups. Sometimes you even fly on commercial airliners for the first leg of the journey. I remember flying to South America first with a couple of other SEALs, all of us dressed like regular civilians. From there, we hitched a ride on a military transport flight that would take us the rest of the way into Afghanistan. But my entire mindset during this whole process was singular. I am going to war. This is it. I remember being on that last military plane, the one that would actually take us into the country. When we crossed into Afghan airspace, an active war zone, the whole atmosphere inside the plane changed. The military pilots switched the interior lights from the normal bright white overhead lights to a deep, ominous red. Then, an announcement came over the intercom telling everyone to stay away from the windows. The reason was simple. We were beginning our descent, the most vulnerable part of the flight. In theory, the plane could be shot at from the ground, and you didn't want to be sitting next to a window if that happened. Now, realistically, if a rocket-propelled grenade hits the side of the plane, it's not going to matter much where you're sitting. But it was this stark, sudden reminder of where we were. We were about to land in a place where people might try to shoot us out of the sky. The way these planes landed was an experience in itself. To minimize the time they were in range of small arms fire from the ground, they would perform what's called a combat landing. They'd fly in high and then basically nosedive towards the runway, a steep, spiraling descent to lose altitude as quickly as possible before leveling out at the last second to land. It was a gnarly, stomach-churning maneuver. So, there we were, strapped into our seats, the cabin bathed in red light, everyone staying clear of the windows as the plane corkscrewed towards the ground. I just kept thinking, okay, here we go. This is Afghanistan. We touched down hard, but safely. We were at a large, well-fortified base called Forward Operating Base Shank. After we taxied to a stop, the huge rear ramp of the plane began to lower. My mind was still locked in that combat mode. I grabbed my pack, the rest of my gear had been shipped on pallets weeks earlier, and I walked down the ramp with a buddy from my team. We stepped out onto the tarmac, and I saw Afghanistan for the first time. The windows on the plane had just been tiny portholes, and we'd been told to avoid them anyway, so this was my first real look. And it stopped me in my tracks. It was unbelievably beautiful. In every direction, 360 degrees, were these enormous, majestic mountains with snow-capped peaks rising up into a crystal-clear blue sky. There were vast, green fields. It was this stunning, untouched-looking land. And right in the middle of it all was this jagged scar on the earth, the NATO base, a sprawling complex of gravel and concrete barriers from which war was conducted. The contrast was jarring. It just didn't compute. This place was too beautiful for a war. But that moment of awe was brief. We were quickly ushered over to a holding area, and before long, we were loaded into these heavily armored military vehicles called MRAPs. These things are massive, designed to withstand IED blasts. And then we were off, driving out of the relative safety of the main base, out into the sticks, to a much smaller, much more remote forward operating base where we would be living and working for the next 6 months. Our mission there was going to be dangerous. We would be actively out there fighting. We arrived at our new home late that night. It was a very stripped-down, vulnerable-feeling place in the middle of nowhere. The SEAL team we were replacing was still there, finishing up their tour. There were also local interpreters who are an absolutely essential part of the war effort. A lot of these guys were young, in their 20s, and they had been working on these bases for years, moving from one rotating unit to the next. They were in a tough spot. By working with NATO forces, they were seen as traitors by the Taliban and other militant groups, which made them targets. They couldn't really leave the base. The great promise for them was that, in exchange for their service, they would eventually be given a visa to come to the United States. That worked out for some, but not all. And these guys were tough. They had been in more gunfights than most of the soldiers they worked with. They had seen some crazy things. My specific role in the platoon involved working closely with these interpreters and our partner force of Afghan soldiers. So that first night, in this overwhelming new environment, I met with one of our interpreters to get a lay of the land. The outgoing team, SEAL Team 8, was so seasoned by this point, they'd been in combat for 6 months straight. They all had huge beards, they were all jacked, and they had this casual, fearless air about them that made me feel incredibly green. I sat down with this interpreter, a guy who was maybe 25 or 26, and we talked about upcoming operations and got to know each other a bit. At some point, he leaned in and said to me in the slang he'd picked up from years of hanging around American soldiers, bro, have you heard the story? The story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? We were in a different province, but he was talking about Kandahar. And I would soon find out that there was this persistent legend, this story that got passed around among the soldiers and interpreters about a giant, a huge living creature that was found in a cave somewhere in the mountains of Kandahar. Afghanistan is a country of mountains and caves. There are vast, unexplored cave systems that have been there for millennia, untouched by modern humanity. And this interpreter, he was dead serious. He said, bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this? He wanted to know more. We didn't talk much more about it that night, but it planted a seed in my mind. This guy, who had seen real combat and lived a hard life, genuinely believed there was some truth to this wild folkloric story. It stuck with me. Fast forward years later, I'm out of the military. I've started telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories online, and as I was thinking about what stories to tell, I suddenly remembered the Kandahar giant. I thought, I should look into that, see if there's any truth to what my interpreter was talking about. And what I found was a treasure trove of testimony, specifically from a group of Green Berets. It seemed one particular team had apparently encountered something truly otherworldly in the caves of Kandahar. One soldier from that team, who went by the name Mr. K, to protect his identity, had given a shocking, detailed account of what they saw. I felt like I had to tell that story to pick up where my interpreter had left off. So, the story goes like this. Back in 2002, an Army infantry unit was on a routine patrol in the vast, rugged mountain range of Kandahar province. You have to picture it. Massive, snow-covered mountains, deep valleys, a huge and desolate area. In 2002, a patrol like this would often be looking for cave systems that could be used as hideouts for Taliban fighters. These patrols were common, almost mundane. And every military operation, no matter how routine, is meticulously planned. You have a route, a timeline, checkpoints, and communication schedules. You're in constant contact with your higher command, updating them on your progress. At some point during this patrol, the infantry unit just went silent. Higher command lost all contact with them. Now, losing communication in the mountains of Afghanistan wasn't totally unheard of. The radios weren't always reliable, and the terrain could easily block a signal. But usually, you'd get it back pretty quickly. This was different. A significant amount of time passed, and there was just radio silence. As the command post started to get more and more concerned, someone noticed something else that was deeply troubling. Not only had the unit gone silent, but they had not called in a tick before they did. A tick is military slang for troops in contact. It's what you immediately call in over the radio the second you start taking enemy fire. It's the first and most important thing you do because it puts everyone on high alert. It signals that you might need air support, you might need a medical evacuation, you might need reinforcements. Because of this, soldiers are trained to call in a tick at the slightest provocation. If anything, people are too quick to call one in. It's a bit of a cheat code to get a lot of assets looking after you. For an entire unit to be in a situation so bad that they disappear off the map, and to do so without calling in that they were under attack, was almost inconceivable. It meant that whatever happened to them, it was either a catastrophic communication failure on a scale they'd never seen, or it was something else entirely, something that didn't fit any known scenario. After enough time had passed with no contact, the Army decided this was a major crisis. A whole unit was missing. They made the call to send in an elite special forces team to find them. They tasked a unit of Green Berets. Their mission: go to the infantry unit's last known location in the mountains of Kandahar and find out what happened. And one of the soldiers in that Green Beret detachment was Mr. K. Mr. Kay and his small team of Green Berets boarded helicopters and flew out to the remote section of the mountains where the unit was last heard from. They touched down in a place that was as rural as it gets. There were no towns, no villages, just the occasional mud hut dotting an otherwise empty landscape of rock and sky. It felt, as it often does in the remote parts of Afghanistan, like being on another planet. They got out and scanned the area. There was nobody. No locals, no American soldiers, nothing. It was a wasteland. They knew the search area was large and the terrain was brutal. It was going to be a long, difficult hike. They set off carrying extremely heavy packs loaded with ammo, water, and gear. They had a rough idea of the missing unit's planned route, so they followed that general direction of travel. For several days, they hiked through the unforgiving mountains. They saw signs of enemy fighters a couple of times in the distance, but their mission was search and rescue, not to engage. So they pressed on, just hiking and looking, finding absolutely no sign of the missing soldiers. The mountains kept their secrets. Finally, on the fourth day of their search, Mr. K and his team came across a narrow goat trail that snaked its way up the side of a mountain. They decided to follow it. There was no specific intelligence that pointed them this way. It was more of a practical decision. The rest of the terrain was rugged and difficult to traverse, and this was an actual path. It would be easier walking, and it would take them up to a higher elevation, giving them a better vantage point to survey the valley on the other side. As they began their ascent up the winding trail, they started to notice things. Small bits of plastic and metal strewn along the path. At first, they didn't know what they were, but as they continued, they began to recognize the fragments as pieces of U.S. military equipment. Parts of radios, pieces of gear. Now, they were on high alert. Rifles at the ready, they moved up the trail with a new sense of caution and urgency. This was obviously connected to the missing unit. They had no idea what they were about to find at the top of this mountain. An ambush? A firefight? Survivors? The higher they climbed, the more evidence they found. The pieces of equipment got bigger. They found entire backpacks ripped and discarded, large chunks of communication gear, and then they started finding pieces of uniforms, torn fabric that still had name tags and unit patches on them. They could clearly see that the patches belonged to the specific infantry unit they were searching for. They knew they were on the right path. They had found their first real lead, and it painted a grim picture. These men, the Green Berets, are among the most highly trained soldiers in the world. In a situation like this, no matter how tense or strange, their training would take over completely. They would be dialed in, moving with precision and purpose, ready for anything. They made their way to the very top of the goat trail. When they crested the ridge, they saw a wide, flat plateau. Beyond the plateau, the mountain continued to rise, and set into the rock face were three large, dark cave entrances, like doorways leading into the mountain itself. And scattered all across the plateau was a horrific scene. There was more military equipment everywhere, but now it was mixed with what were clearly human bones. The missing unit was not there, not alive anyway. It was obvious that something terrible had happened on this mountaintop. Immediately, the team fanned out, taking up tactical positions around the plateau. They knew they had to clear those caves. The survivors could be in there, or the enemy who did this could be hiding inside. Mr. K and his shooting buddy, a man named Dan, were tasked with approaching the entrance of one of the caves to take a look inside. While the rest of the team provided cover, they moved silently across the bone-strewn plateau. Mr. K said he reached the entrance, a massive, dark opening in the rock. It was big enough to just walk right into, but inside it was pitch black. He took a few steps into the cave. It was cold and damp. He was trying to let his eyes adjust to the darkness when he realized he was standing at the edge of a sheer cliff. The floor of the cave just dropped away into a deep, black pit. He caught himself just in time and peered down, trying to see the bottom, but it was too dark. As he straightened up, he caught a flash of movement from the back of the cave on the other side of the chasm. Instinctively, Mr. K raised his rifle, ready to fire. But before he could, an enormous spear, like a massive javelin, came flying out of the darkness. It moved with incredible speed and struck Dan, his partner, who was standing right next to him. The force of the impact was so great, it threw Dan backwards out of the cave entrance, where he landed on the plateau in full view of the entire team. Seconds later, before they could even process what had just happened, a creature came bounding out of the cave. It was huge, a humanoid figure that Mr. K estimated was at least 12 feet tall. It effortlessly leaped over the chasm inside the cave and charged out onto the plateau. It had fiery red hair and a long red beard. Its skin was pale, and it had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. It was clad in animal skins and let out a roar as it charged towards them. But the Green Berets reacted instantly. They opened fire. A storm of bullets from multiple directions hit the creature, and in a matter of seconds, the giant fell to the ground, dead. The plateau fell silent. The entire encounter had lasted less than a minute. The team's training kicked in again. Once the threat was down, they rushed over to Dan to provide medical aid, but it was too late. The spear had killed him instantly. The team was now in an impossible situation. They hadn't found the missing unit, they had a casualty of their own, and they had just killed a creature that shouldn't exist. The team leader got on the radio and called higher command. He tried to explain the situation. "You have to come get us," he said. "We have a man down, KIA. And we have a hostile, a very large hostile. You need to come get it too. We don't know what it is." Not long after, 2 helicopters arrived. One was for the Green Berets and the body of their fallen comrade, Dan. The other helicopter was equipped with a huge cargo net. The crew lowered the net, and the soldiers on the ground wrapped it around the body of the dead giant. The helicopter then lifted it up and flew away, the massive form dangling beneath it. Mr. K and his team expected to be debriefed as soon as they got back to base. A debrief is standard procedure. You write an after-action report detailing exactly what happened on the mission. It's how the military documents events and learns from them. They expected to tell their incredible story and maybe, just maybe, get some answers about what the hell they had just encountered. But when they got back to base, things were strange. No one came to talk to them. They were basically isolated and told to just write down what happened. So they did. They wrote the truth, every unbelievable detail. Every member of the team had seen the same thing. But when they submitted the report, they were told by a superior officer that they could not include those details. They were ordered to change the report. "We can't say you fought a giant in a cave," the officer told them. "That's not going in the official record. Change it." So, despite knowing it was a lie, they rewrote the report. They stated that they had made contact with an enemy force and that Dan had been killed by enemy small arms fire. After they submitted the falsified report, they were all forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, legally binding documents, forbidding them from ever talking about what they had actually seen. After that, it was as if it never happened. When they tried to look for more information, they found that all reports related to that operation were heavily redacted or classified as top secret. Mr. K never even found out what happened to the original missing infantry unit. Their fate remains a mystery. For 14 years, Mr. K and his teammates kept this secret. But the weight of it, the injustice of it, was too much. Dan had been killed, and the official story was a lie. In 2016, Mr. K decided to go public. He spoke to some of the other members of his team, and they felt the same way. It was wrong that the truth was being buried. As he began to tell his story, he discovered that other people in the military had also encountered the giant. The pilots and crew of the helicopter that airlifted the body out remembered seeing a 12 to 15-foot tall, six-fingered giant in their cargo net. They, too, had been told to keep silent, their reports redacted and classified. It seemed that everyone who had been involved with the incident was sworn to secrecy, and the government had gone to great lengths to cover the whole thing up. I don't know what to make of this story. There's a part of me that wants to believe the testimony of Mr. K and the others. But there's also a part of me that knows how wild it sounds. Still, so many people claim to have seen this thing. And I can so clearly remember my own interpreter back in 2013 sitting in that dusty little base in the middle of the night, being so convinced that there was something real and terrifying in the caves of Kandahar. I've been in those mountains. I've walked past those dark cave entrances. And I can tell you, looking up at them, you get an unsettling feeling. Who knows what's inside? In a landscape that vast and ancient, a place that feels like another planet, it doesn't seem entirely impossible. What we're left with is a mystery. An entire infantry unit is still unaccounted for, at least in the public record. A Green Beret named Dan was killed in action, and his teammates, who saw it happen, want the truth to be known. It seems clear the government disguised the truth. Whether they're covering something up is a question that remains unanswered. Thanks for listening. It's strange how sometimes an entire life can hinge on one tiny moment. One snapped twig in the dark. One uneasy feeling in your stomach. One decision to turn around instead of taking one more step forward. Rachel and Molly walked away from that cemetery without realizing how close they had come to something truly horrific, and somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, there are still stories buried beneath rock, secrecy, and silence that may never fully be explained. Maybe that's what makes stories like these stay with us long after they end. Not just the fear, but the realization that the world is still full of places where the truth disappears into the dark. Until next time, stay safe and be careful what you follow into the unknown. See ya. In the late 1990s, in a small, quiet town nestled in rural New York, there were two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly. And they were best friends. They were part of a larger circle of friends, a tight-knit group that navigated the halls of their high school together, but Rachel and Molly had a bond that was a little different, a little deeper. What really drew them together, what formed the core of their friendship and their social circle, was a shared love for goth culture. Now, if you remember the late 90s and the early 2000s, being a goth kid in high school was a very specific identity. It meant a wardrobe composed almost entirely of the color black. It meant black nail polish, black lipstick, and almost always dyed black hair. It was about embracing all things dark and macabre. For some, it was a profound philosophical stance, a way of looking at the world that acknowledged the shadows. For others, it was more of a fashion statement, a way to stand out. But for Rachel and Molly, it was a bit of both. They were committed to the aesthetic, but they also genuinely loved the whole vibe, the art, the music, the literature. It was their world. And one of the central activities in their world, something that became a ritual for them and their friends, was hanging out in the local cemetery. At first, it was almost a joke. They were the goth kids, so of course they would hang out in a cemetery. It felt a little on the nose, a bit of a cliche they wanted to lean into for the sheer irony of it all. So, the whole group went out there one evening, almost as a dare to themselves, to fulfill the stereotype. But then, something unexpected happened. They discovered that they actually liked it there. The cemetery was peaceful. It was quiet. It was a place where they could be themselves, away from the judgment of their classmates and the prying eyes of their parents. It became their spot, their go-to hangout, especially on the weekends. Typically, when Rachel, Molly, and the rest of their friends went to the cemetery, they'd go at night. This was partly to maximize the atmosphere, to really lean into the whole dark, gothic aesthetic they loved so much. But there was another, more practical reason they always went as a group. A cemetery at night, no matter how much you romanticize it, is still a little bit creepy. There was a sense of safety in numbers. The laughter and chatter of their friends cut through the silence and kept the deeper, more unsettling feelings at bay. It was fun with a group. It felt safe with a group. So, it was an unspoken rule that Rachel and Molly never went there alone, just the two of them. It was always a package deal, the whole crew or nothing. One particular Friday night, the air was starting to get that cool autumn crispness to it. Rachel was at home, probably listening to music in her room, when the phone rang. It was Molly. Her voice was cheerful on the other end of the line. She asked, "Hey, want to go hang out at the cemetery?" And Rachel's immediate thought was, of course, that's what they did on a Friday night. It was the plan. She said, "Duh. I'd love to go. Come pick me up. Let's go." So Rachel got ready. She pulled on her favorite black jeans, a band t-shirt, and her worn-in combat boots. She applied a fresh coat of dark lipstick and waited by the front door. A little while later, she saw the familiar headlights of Molly's car pull into her driveway. But as she walked out, the first thing she noticed was that the car was empty, except for Molly in the driver's seat. There was no one else. Usually, the car would be full, a hub of noise and energy as their friends piled in. This was different. Rachel opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, a question already on her lips. She looked over at Molly and asked, "Hey, so where is everybody? Are we going to pick them up now?" Molly gave a little shrug, her hands still on the steering wheel. She said, "Actually, no. I tried calling everyone. But people are either busy, or they have to work, or they're still recovering from last night. It's just going to be us two tonight. Is that okay?" And Rachel felt a little knot of unease in her stomach. It wasn't okay, not really. This wasn't how they did things. It wasn't about her trust in Molly. They were as close as sisters. It was about the place. The cemetery. At night, alone. The idea felt uncomfortable, a little too vulnerable. The safety of the group was a crucial part of the experience. But she looked at Molly, who seemed to have already made peace with the idea. Molly was ready to go, and Rachel didn't want to be the one to back out, to be a buzzkill. She didn't want to be rude. So, she pushed her hesitation down and forced a smile. "Oh yeah, that's fine," she said, trying to make her voice sound convincing. "It'll be great. Just the two of us. Let's go." And with that, even with the reluctance lingering in the back of her mind, she settled into her seat. Molly put the car in drive, and they pulled away from the house, heading the short half-mile towards the old cemetery. This cemetery was enormous. It was one of those sprawling, ancient places with tombstones that dated back centuries. As they pulled up to the entrance, the first thing you saw was this huge, medieval-looking gate. It was a massive stone archway that stretched across the entrance road, with big wrought iron gates that were permanently chained open. It was a very Gothic, very dramatic entrance, and it set the tone for the whole place. Once you drove through that archway, you were on a long, straight road that cut right through the middle of the cemetery, all the way to the back. It was a huge property, probably over a mile from the front gate to the back fence. This central road effectively split the cemetery into two distinct halves, a right side and a left side. And the spot where Rachel, Molly, and their friends always hung out was in the back left corner. They loved this area for a very specific reason. The left side of the cemetery was full of rolling hills, gentle slopes where the plots were laid out, and in that far back left corner, there was a natural depression in the earth, a shallow little valley. In this depression, there weren't many tombstones. Instead, there was a big moss-covered boulder and a gnarled old tree right next to it. It was a perfect hideaway. If you were standing at the front gate and scanning across the vast expanse of the cemetery, you wouldn't be able to see anyone who was down in that little depression. They were completely tucked away, hidden by the lay of the land. For a group of teenagers looking for a private place to hang out, it was ideal. It was their sanctuary, away from the world. So Rachel and Molly drove through the imposing stone gate, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires. They made their way down that long central road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By now, the sun had almost completely set. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the long shadows of the tombstones were melting into the growing darkness. It was quiet, utterly still. There was no one else around, which wasn't unusual. The place was almost always deserted. Occasionally, on the other side of the cemetery, the far right-hand side, some of the college kids from the local university would hop the fence. They had a spot over there where they'd sometimes build a bonfire right up against the fence line. It was totally against the rules, but they would sneak over and do it every now and then. But that was a rare occurrence. Other than those occasional trespassers, the cemetery was their private domain. They reached the end of the road, and Molly parked the car. They got out, the car doors closing with a dull thud that seemed incredibly loud in the silence. They walked from the road, across the damp grass, and down the gentle slope into their familiar depression. Once they were at the bottom, they settled into their usual spots. They took up positions on the big boulder, leaning their backs against the rough bark of the old tree. They lit up cigarettes and just started talking. This was their routine. They were just two goth teenagers in rural New York in the late 1990s doing what they did. They talked about everything and nothing. They swapped stories about their boyfriends, complained about teachers, and dissected the latest drama at school. As time passed, the last bit of light faded from the sky, and it became fully dark. A blanket of stars appeared overhead. And in the quiet comfort of their spot, the girls were just having a nice time. Rachel even thought to herself that this was actually kind of nice. It wasn't as scary as she'd imagined it would be. It was just good, quality time with her best friend. But after they'd been there for a while, a new scent drifted to them on the gentle breeze. It was the smell of smoke. Wood smoke. Immediately, their minds went to the college kids. That bonfire spot on the complete opposite side of the cemetery. It was a long way off, but the smell of a bonfire could carry. When they had first arrived, they had glanced over in that direction and hadn't seen anything, but they'd been hanging out for a good while now. It was entirely possible that in the time they'd been down in their depression, a group of students had hopped the fence, started a fire, and that was what they were smelling. Now, a fire on the other side of the cemetery didn't directly affect them. They were on opposite ends of the property. But they knew from experience what a bonfire meant. It meant that, eventually, the police would show up. Someone would eventually see the flames and call it in. The police would come, they would make the college kids put out their fire, and then they would do a full sweep of the entire cemetery to kick out anyone else who was trespassing. That included them. So, Rachel and Molly looked at each other. They didn't even need to say anything. They both had the same thought. They should probably just pack it up and leave now before the cops arrived and made them leave. Besides, they had been there for quite a while. They were getting ready to head home anyway. This just sped up the timeline a bit. It was no big deal. They put out their last cigarettes, gathered their things, and turned to walk back up the hill, back the way they had come, towards the road where Molly's car was parked. As they walked up the grassy slope, they expected to reach the top, crest the hill, and see their car waiting for them. They expected to look out across the vast, dark cemetery and maybe, just maybe, see the distant flicker of the bonfire way off on the other side. But when they reached the top of the hill and their eyes adjusted, that's not what they saw. Their car was there, right where they left it. But when they looked for the fire, it wasn't on the far side of the cemetery at all. Instead, just to their right, maybe 100 meters away, they saw it. There was another depression in the landscape over there, another rolling hill that dipped down out of sight. And rising from that depression, they could see the tops of flickering flames. A fire was burning right there on their side of the cemetery, practically next to them. This was wrong. This was completely out of the ordinary. They knew for a fact that they were alone on this side when they arrived. There was nobody else here. So, sometime while they were down in their spot, someone else had shown up and started a fire. They had never seen anyone do this over here. It wasn't the college kids' spot. This was something new, and it was unsettling. Their first thought was a mix of curiosity and caution. Who was over there? Had the college kids decided to move to a new spot? They couldn't see the person or the people around the fire, only the orange flames licking up over the edge of the hill. They were sure that whoever was over there had no idea that they were right here, just one hill over. A mischievous idea popped into Molly's head. She whispered to Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could peek over and see who it is. We could spy on them." The idea was intriguing. They were already there. Why not? So, the two girls turned around and walked back down into the base of their own depression. They passed the big rock and the tree where they had been sitting for the past couple of hours and started walking up the opposite slope, the one that bordered the neighboring depression with the fire. They moved as quietly as they could, trying to be stealthy. As they got closer and closer to the top of the hill, the smell of smoke got stronger and they could hear the soft crackle of the fire. Just as they were about to reach the crest, where they would be able to peer over and see everything, Rachel's foot came down on a dry branch. It snapped with a loud crack that seemed to echo in the silent night. The only other sound was the fire. They hadn't heard any voices, no music, no laughter. Just the crackle of flames. The sudden noise Rachel made felt like a gunshot. She instantly clapped her hands over her mouth and looked at Molly with wide, apologetic eyes. Molly shot her a look that said, "What are you doing?" "We're supposed to be sneaking." And then they both just froze. They stood perfectly still, listening, waiting to see if they had been heard. But there was no reaction from the other side of the hill. Just silence. An eerie, heavy silence. And in that moment, the entire mood shifted. The playful, adventurous feeling was gone, replaced by a cold sense of dread. They hadn't even reached the top of the hill yet. They hadn't seen who was at the fire. But something just felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The two girls looked at each other, and the same thought was reflected in their eyes. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe they should just turn around and leave. They both nodded in silent agreement. "Yeah, let's get out of here," one of them whispered. "This doesn't feel right." So, right then and there, as quietly as they could, they turned and retreated. They walked back down to the center of their depression, past the rock and the tree, and started walking back up the original side of the hill, the side that led to their car. They were halfway up the slope, their backs to the fire, when for some reason, Rachel glanced back over her shoulder. She looked back towards the hill they had just been on, the one they were trying to spy from. And what she saw made her blood run cold. There was a man standing on the ridgeline now. The fire was behind him, silhouetting his figure, making him a dark, ominous shape against the flickering orange light. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly in their direction. He wasn't saying anything. He was just watching them. It was clear now. He was the one at the fire. He must have heard the noise they made. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. She whipped her head around and grabbed Molly's arm. "Molly, look! Look! Look!" she hissed. Molly turned, and her eyes widened in fear. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know who that is. We have to go. Now." And with that, they broke into a frantic, scrambling walk up the rest of the hill. A second later, Rachel risked another look back. The man was no longer on the hill. For a terrifying split second, she thought he was gone. But then she saw movement in the darkness of the depression between the hills. He was running. He was coming down the hill, and he was coming right for them. The girls started screaming. Pure, instinctual terror. They stopped walking and started sprinting, their feet stumbling on the uneven ground. They ran for the car, their lungs burning. Rachel kept looking back, and the man was gaining on them. He was fast. They finally reached the road, their feet pounding on the asphalt. They scrambled to Molly's car, yanking on the door handles. They jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and fumbled to lock them. Molly jammed the key into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn it. The engine roared to life. She threw the car into reverse, then into drive, and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires squealed as they sped away down the long, dark cemetery road. As they were driving, Rachel looked out the back window one last time. She saw the man. He had reached the road, just a few feet from where their car had been. He had almost caught them. He stood there for a moment, watching them drive away, and then he slowly, deliberately turned and walked back down the hill, disappearing into the darkness. They were both completely shaken up. Their hearts were pounding, and they were breathing in ragged gasps. That was not a college kid. That was a grown man, maybe in his 40s, someone they had never seen before. The whole situation was just so creepy, so wrong. They didn't know what to make of it. As Molly drove Rachel home, the adrenaline started to wear off, replaced by a shaky confusion. What would have happened if he had reached them? What did he want? What was he doing out there with a fire all by himself? But by the time Molly pulled up to Rachel's house, they had started to process the fear by turning it into a crazy story. They were trying to downplay it, to make it seem less terrifying than it was. "Man, that was crazy, huh?" Molly said, trying to laugh it off. They chalked it up to just a weird, scary night. A story they'd tell their friends on Monday. A warning to themselves to never go to the cemetery alone again. Rachel got out of the car and went inside her house. She didn't even tell her mom what had happened. She was still too wired and confused. She just put her stuff down, went to her room, and tried to calm her racing heart. Molly drove to her own house and did the same. She didn't tell anyone. She just went to her room and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Rachel woke up feeling groggy. She went downstairs to the kitchen to get some breakfast. Her mom was already in there, going about her morning routine, making coffee. When she saw Rachel, she smiled and asked casually, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel just shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out. Nothing special." Her mom nodded, then her expression turned a bit more serious. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. "No, what do you mean? What happened?" Her mom took a sip of her coffee. "Well," she said, "a woman in our town was kidnapped." She paused for a moment. "She was actually taken from the same parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me." Rachel felt a jolt of alarm. "Oh my God," she said. "What happened to her? Did they find her?" Rachel's mom looked at her, and her face was grim. "No," she said softly. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead, and then she delivered the final devastating piece of information. In fact, whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. And they burned her in a huge bonfire. Her mom's voice dropped to a whisper. And they still haven't caught the person who did it. When Rachel heard those words, it was like the entire world tilted on its axis. Everything came crashing down. Suddenly, she understood exactly what had happened the night before. That fire wasn't just a fire. That man wasn't just some random creep. He was the killer. That fire they had smelled, the one they had almost walked right up to, it very likely contained the body of that poor woman. They had been right there. No more than 100 meters away while this horrific act was taking place. It was even more terrifying to realize that they were probably there when the killer first arrived, when he set everything up, when he started that fire. And the most chilling thought of all, what would have happened if he had caught them? What was he trying to do when he chased them? Was he trying to silence the only witnesses to his crime? A wave of nausea washed over Rachel. She started to tremble, and she poured her heart out to her mom. She told her everything. About Molly calling, about going to the cemetery alone, about the strange fire, about the man on the hill, about the terrifying chase to the car. Her mom listened, her face growing paler with every word. When Rachel finished, her mom was horrified. "Oh my God," she said, pulling Rachel into a hug. "I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police. They haven't caught this guy yet. You saw him. You have a description of him. You have to talk to them." So that's what they did. Rachel immediately got on the phone and called Molly, telling her what she had just learned. Molly became hysterical on the other end, crying, barely able to speak. They couldn't believe how close they had come to a truly terrible fate. They went to the police station together. They sat down with a detective and told him everything they could remember about the man. Unfortunately, their description wasn't much to go on. It had been dark, and they had been terrified. All they could really say was that he looked to be about average height, maybe in his 40s. It wasn't a lot for the police to work with, but it was something. And luckily, they wouldn't have to rely on that description alone. Just 48 hours later, the police got the break they needed. It wasn't because of the girl's description, but because of a bit of luck and good police work. An officer on patrol spotted the victim's car being driven around town. A BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, had been issued for the vehicle. The officer pulled the car over, and the person behind the wheel was the killer. After he was arrested, he made a full confession to the kidnapping and the murder. Rachel and Molly were safe. The man who had chased them was behind bars. But they would never forget that night. They thought back to that moment when Rachel accidentally stepped on the branch, making that loud noise. At the time, it felt like a stupid mistake, a clumsy move that could have gotten them caught spying. But now, they realized it was the sound that had likely saved their lives. That noise made them pause. It made them feel uneasy. It made them rethink their decision and turn back. If that hadn't happened, if they had continued up and over that hill, they would have come face to face with a killer in the middle of him disposing of a body. And it's almost certain that two teenage girls, the only witnesses to his crime, would have ended up in that bonfire as well. Their favorite hangout spot, a place they once saw as a sanctuary of ironic coolness, was now forever tainted by the memory of what they almost stumbled into, and the terrifying reality of the darkness that can hide in the most familiar places. Stories like this are terrifying because they remind us how close ordinary people can come to extraordinary evil without ever realizing it. One normal Friday night, one familiar place, one small decision, and suddenly everything changes. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Sometimes the darkest moments don't begin with screams or warning signs. Sometimes they begin in silence. Until next time. On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 12th of April, 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnick was just finishing up with his last patient of the day. His practice was located in the small rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed the patient a free toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup, and then he walked into his back office to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything together, he walked out through the reception area. He told his receptionist to have a wonderful night, and she waved back and gave him a big, friendly smile. But as soon as John stepped out of the building and the door closed behind him, that cheerful expression completely vanished from his face. The truth was, John had a lot of problems weighing on him, and pretending to be happy and untroubled all day at work was becoming incredibly exhausting. And so, John walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his dental practice to the small house he was living in. John had actually grown up right there in Blairsville. It had been his lifelong dream to build a life and raise a family in his hometown. So, when he graduated from dental school about 13 years earlier, he had a choice. He could have easily set up his practice in a big city and probably made a much higher salary right from the start. But instead, he decided to come home and join the practice of his own childhood dentist right there in downtown Blairsville. And it turned out to be a great decision. John was able to make a lot of money in his hometown. His dental practice really took off, partly because John himself was just a really charming guy. He was great with kids, and so families from all over the area wanted to come to him. With the extra money he was making, which was way more than he ever expected, he started investing in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnick was a millionaire. But it wasn't until he met his wife, Michelle, that he truly felt like his life was complete. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children already, and for John, this was perfect. It meant she came with a ready-made family that he could love as his own. Some of John's friends were a bit worried. They thought maybe Michelle was only interested in him for his money. But then, John's mother got sick with cancer, and Michelle stepped up without hesitation. She became his mother's full-time caregiver, looking after her with incredible compassion. For John, that was all the proof he needed. He knew then that Michelle truly cared for him and his family. And so, the two of them got married in 1997. Shortly after their marriage, they adopted a little boy together who they named JJ. Now, with their 3 children, this big new family moved into a beautiful house with a swimming pool and a hot tub. On the outside, it looked like everything was absolutely perfect. But now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of his current home, it was a much more modest place. He just sat there for a moment, staring at this little house he was living in, and he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely. These days, John was extremely tight on money. He was a generous person, and he'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the difficult position of having to ask for that money back, because he literally needed it to get by. And then there was his marriage. He and Michelle had hit a horrible rough patch that just never seemed to end. They had both admitted to having affairs. And so now they were living separately. That was why John was pulling up to this small, quiet house instead of the big family home with the pool and the hot tub. But as bad as the financial stress and the marital problems were, they weren't the worst thing in John's life. There was a third stressor, one that was far more terrifying. John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. This fear had started about 2 weeks earlier. Someone had vandalized his car with spray paint. The police had looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And on its own, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to kill you. But for John, it just felt different. It felt personal, like someone was specifically targeting him. And over the next several days, that feeling grew from "my car was vandalized" to "my car was vandalized, and I think it means someone is trying to kill me." John believed this so strongly that he had recently gone to see his attorney. He gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her it was just in case he ended up dead. She could use that money to help investigate his murder. Now, John finally got out of his car. He walked up the porch steps, went into his home, and closed and locked the door behind him. The house was so quiet, and it just made him feel even more depressed. He wished his adopted son JJ was there. JJ always made the house feel so much more alive. But these days, John didn't get to see him very much. Long stretches of time would pass between their visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents that he had been avoiding. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but she and John had never been able to come to a final agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to try and save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The reason the divorce had dragged on for so long was because of what they were fighting over. It was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, and John absolutely refused to give up his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last settled on a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork. And tomorrow, it would be John's turn to sign. And so John sat down on his couch and turned on the television. But he couldn't focus on the show. He was just too restless, too anxious. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close with. He talked with her for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He stretched out on the couch, and right there in the living room, he fell asleep. The next day, around 3:30 in the afternoon, a 9-year-old boy named Zach Use, who lived right next door to John, walked out of his front door and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son JJ was around and could come out to play. He wasn't sure if JJ would be there since he split his time between his mom's and his dad's places, but he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped. He noticed something was wrong. There was a small glass panel to the left of the front door, and it had been completely shattered. There was broken glass all over the porch, and Zach could also see streaks of what looked like a dried red liquid right underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He saw it and thought it had to be blood. His first instinct was to turn and run away as fast as he could. But then he thought about his friend, JJ. He was worried that maybe JJ was inside and in some kind of trouble. He couldn't just leave him. So, gathering up all the courage a 9-year-old boy could, Zach slowly and nervously walked up the rest of the steps to the front door. He tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. And so, as carefully as he could, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel, trying his best not to cut himself on the sharp edges. He reached inside and was able to turn the lock from the inside. Then, he opened the door. As soon as he stepped into the house, he saw it. There were papers strewn all over the floor of the foyer, and in the middle of it all, there was a body. It was laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach didn't hesitate. He turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lead of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving in her car with her husband and their 4 children. She got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a little confusing. All dispatch could tell her was that there had been a cardiac arrest and that she was needed at the scene. There was no other information. So, thinking it was probably a routine medical call like a heart attack, Corporal Lead just drove her family straight over to the address. But when she pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she knew immediately that this was not a simple heart attack. She saw a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and the look on his face was grim. Lyde walked over to him, and he immediately pointed to the broken glass panel and the dark stains on the ground. She asked him what was going on. She told him she was told this was a cardiac arrest. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and see for yourself." So Lead turned and waved to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she just needed a minute. Then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was stunned by what she saw. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, and there, in the center of it all, amongst all the scattered papers, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen in her life. Now, Corporal Lead had never actually worked a homicide case before, but as she stood there, trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the man's body, she knew without a doubt that this was not a cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup, and she needed it fast. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a medical emergency, the police had not sent a full response. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. Lyde was suddenly very aware that the killer, or killers, could still be in the area, maybe even still inside the house. They hadn't even secured the property yet. And she was thinking about how she had brought her husband and her children with her. They were sitting in the car right outside. So she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house. Then she went back out onto the front lawn to essentially stand guard between the murder scene and her family, her hand resting on the gun in her holster. Luckily, it wasn't long before Lead heard the sound of approaching emergency sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came out of the house and told her it was empty. The killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery the officer had made was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim's blood had seeped through the floorboards from above. At this point, Lead said goodbye to her husband and kids and sent them home. Then she went back into detective mode and stepped back inside the house. It was around then that someone on the scene told Lead the victim's name. They said his name was John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians began their work, carefully processing all the physical evidence inside the house, Lead started a slow walk through each of the rooms. She was trying to get a sense of who John was and also to piece together how he had died. John's body was found close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that led to his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also covered in those divorce papers. John's body was barefoot. But there were bloody shoe prints in the house that were far too big to belong to the little boy Zach. Lead figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As Lead continued through the house, she didn't see anything that looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The television was still there. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened or rummaged through, and to Lead, this made sense. The murder was extremely violent, which suggested it was very personal. It seemed like the only thing the killer wanted when they came into this house was for John to die a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the home, ending up back in the living room where it looked like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and the note were from someone named Melissa. And when Lead saw the last name, she did a double take. It was Use, the same last name as the neighborhood boy, Zach, who had discovered the body. Lead wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use. And so now, Corporal Lead realized that right there on the coffee table, she had her first two solid leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce. And two, someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that she apparently couldn't afford to pay back all at once. It was evening by the time Lead finally stepped back outside the house. When she did, she saw a crowd had gathered. There were neighbors and reporters all jostling for position out on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, so Lead knew this was going to be a huge story. But for now, she just had to get past them and get back to the station. She needed to get organized for the interviews she'd be conducting tomorrow. But before she could even walk down the front steps, another officer came over to her with an update. Over the past few hours, police had fanned out across the neighborhood, talking to people to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. And they had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, she had been woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she had eventually just gone back to sleep. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling, and it sounded like a very heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, when Lead heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to add a lot more weight to the idea that money might have been the motive for this murder. But the officer said he wasn't finished. He had one more important piece of information for her. In addition to those witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really needed to look into. And that was the Use family. because, according to the neighborhood gossip, Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Corporal Lead was at the police station. She was sitting at a table inside an interrogation room directly across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Again, Lead had never worked a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator and she had a plan for how she was going to handle her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife Michelle and her new boyfriend Kevin. And the reason for that was simple. She had been told that in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Lead had sent an officer to Michelle's house to tell her that her estranged husband was dead. But when the officer got there, Michelle already knew. She said she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So, the officer had to break the news to both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin that it was actually a murder. And according to the officer's report, they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Lead actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin personally. He was a state police trooper, and they had worked together on cases before. But now, Lead was going to have to investigate her own colleague, which was obviously a very delicate situation, especially among police officers. And so, what Lead wanted to do was gather more information before she spoke directly to Michelle and Kevin. First, she wanted to try and rule out the Uses as suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Lead looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. She began by asking them about the $15,000 check that Melissa had written to John, the one found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, kind of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she was really disappointed when he did that, but she also knew John was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said she only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check. That's why she had left the note with it, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she could get the last $1,000 together. Lead watched Melissa closely as she spoke. She did seem truly distraught over John's death. The money issue really didn't seem to be a big deal to her at all compared to the loss of her friend. But the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. And Lead decided she couldn't just dance around it, even though Melissa was sitting right there next to her husband Tom. Lead looked directly at Melissa and asked her straight out if she was having an affair with John. Melissa immediately blushed and said no. She insisted they were just close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lead turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a second, Tom just sat there in silence. But when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. He basically refused to answer the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go and take care of his kids. Now, Lead knew it had been a very blunt question to ask, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. So, by the time Lead told Melissa and Tom that they were free to go, Tom had firmly established himself in her mind as a clear person of interest. Before Lead left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers, who she had sent to observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular vein had been cut by a piece of glass. John also had defensive wounds on his hands, as well as cuts on his back, which suggested that at one point he had tried to run away. Lead already knew it was a brutal murder, but hearing the details from the autopsy just reinforced how much hatred must have been behind it. And so, after hearing these details, Lead thought to herself that whoever did this must have truly, deeply hated John. And she was already thinking she had one suspect, Tom Yusei, whose wife might have been having an affair with the victim. That would certainly be a powerful enough motive to inspire that level of hatred. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lyde felt confident that she would be able to solve this as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, just like she always had on every other case. But this case was already getting a lot of attention in the news, and so Lyde knew there would be pressure to show results, and to show them fast. If she moved too slowly, the case might get taken away from her, or another police agency might be called in to help speed things up. Lyde didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her methodical process. She figured she would just have to find a way to strike a balance. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with some evidence: John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and some tissue samples. Lyde was supposed to send these off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Lyde decided, now that she had these samples in her possession, that she was not going to do that. Lyde wanted to keep all of her investigative options open and to make sure that she knew every single thing that was happening with her evidence in this case. And so, after the officer left, Lyde took the samples to the department refrigerator, put them inside, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Lyde had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They had all painted a picture of John as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Lyde was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as she arrived at the office, she was glad she had come. The dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. During the long, multi-year divorce battle, Michelle had at one point accused John of abusing their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press any charges. But during all the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order. The police had come and arrested him right there at his work in front of his colleagues and patients. So, to John's colleagues, Michelle was a total nightmare. They also said she called the office regularly to demand money and that John often caved in and just gave it to her. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to even speak to her. This detail definitely caught Lyde's attention. It wasn't just the colleagues at the dental practice who said Michelle was money-hungry. A lot of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. John had never really felt comfortable with that kind of flashy lifestyle. And to many of his friends and colleagues, it was that fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. And so, Lyde started to wonder. Maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money just a few days before his murder. Maybe Michelle had called demanding money, and John, for the first time, refused. Could that have been enough to push Michelle to murder him? It was possible. But then, Lyde discovered something else. Michelle was still listed as the beneficiary of John's life insurance policy. If John died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now, there was a twofold financial motive for Michelle to want John dead. But it didn't seem likely that Michelle, on her own, would have been able to overpower John and inflict all those wounds. It just seemed like he would have been able to fight her off. But Lyde thought maybe Michelle hired someone to do it. Someone bigger and stronger. She certainly would have had the money to pay for it. As Lyde left the dental office, she began to think about how she was going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Lyde did not want to make her move too soon, not without more evidence. This wasn't just the first murder case she had ever worked. It was the biggest case, period, that she had ever handled. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she did not want to screw it up. The John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after the murder. Corporal Lyde knew that his friends and family were already starting to get antsy. They wanted to know why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. and Lead understood where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure to solve this case right away. That was weighing on the friends and family. And then there was the fact that John himself had been so paranoid that he was going to be murdered. And now he had turned up dead. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. But Lead also felt that John's family just didn't understand why this was taking so long. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to work a homicide, Lead had developed her own very careful method, and for the next several months, she continued to follow her own protocol. She took her time, but she did it with intention. The crime scene unit hadn't turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene. The bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of her suspects. So for now, Lead was relying heavily on interviews. And she ran down every single tip and rumor she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her three best suspects, Tom Hughes, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John's own family about her failure to solve the case more quickly did get to her. But she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Yusei hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder, when Lead got a call from Melissa. Lead was actually pretty surprised to hear from her. And she was even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Lead showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had visions about the case. Lead was not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter his house, but Lead also knew that John's family was getting really edgy. And if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics that one of her suspects' wives had hired, then that's what she was going to do. So Lead followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lead was doing her best not to roll her eyes. Then they went into the house, which still hadn't been cleaned out and was still splattered with blood. The psychic sisters had a premonition. They said the killing had happened in the dining room area. Then the psychic said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed really excited by all of this. But to Lead, it was all ridiculous. The blood they were literally looking at made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation had been all over the news. The things the psychics were saying were things anyone could have easily learned before showing up. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had hired, were now conveniently clearing her husband was not very convincing. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lead thought the psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off of her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John's family had lost faith in her. But what they didn't know was that she still had one more card to play. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder. At this point, Corporal Lead finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, asking them to take over the investigation. Lead's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of time, but ultimately both John's family and Melissa Hughes had gotten more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt like the psychics had given them just as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed. This meant Lead was losing her case. On the one hand, this was the exact thing that Lead had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency she had expected. And so now, even though it definitely stung, Lyde realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. And so, Lyde went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out the little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick. Her officer had brought them to her right after John's autopsy. She had been told to send them to the state police crime lab right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, she had decided not to do that, and instead, she put the samples in the fridge and she waited. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in, it made the case much more high profile. And that, in turn, allowed Lyde to send the samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a much higher authority. Normally, the FBI would never take samples from a small-town murder case. But now that it was this huge public case making national news, Lyde knew she could take advantage of the situation. So she repackaged the fingernail clippings and the other samples, she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back, Lyde was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading. Her strategy of intentionally slow playing the investigation and sitting on this evidence until this very moment had totally paid off. Finally, on her computer screen, Corporal Lyde was looking at the name of John Yelnick's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of the 13th of April, 2006. Around 12:30 in the morning, the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer got out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching. It was dark and completely silent. So, the killer left the street, walked around to the back of the house, and slipped inside through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room, where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist. They walked right up to John, raised the blade high, and then brought it down directly onto him. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming. He put his hands up to try to protect himself, and he even tried clawing at his attacker, getting the killer's skin underneath his fingernails. John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. He got up and began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down, and the two began to wrestle. As they struggled, the killer kept stabbing John. John was flailing his arms, trying to fight back, and he hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, sending them flying everywhere. And then, somehow, on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. He made it to the front foyer and actually reached for the front doorknob, but the killer shoved him from behind. John went flying towards the pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head crashed right through it. When his head went through the glass, a sharp shard severed his jugular vein, and John bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer watched until John was completely still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood with them. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because they were someone people trusted with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. And the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Lyde had decided not to send that evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lyde knew Kevin, and she liked him. She had basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she started hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. This was partly because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled to be totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin completely believed them. And so, Lyde had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer. And she was afraid that her case would be taken over, not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was terrified that if Kevin was guilty, she couldn't really trust the state police crime lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would find out about the evidence and try to interfere himself. It was just too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence there. So Lead had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she had held on to the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case. And that's when Lead got her access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists finally tested the DNA that was found under John's fingernails and found that it was a perfect match for Kevin Foley. In the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never charged in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.